Good evening, El Paso. This is Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share raising the big questions with you and having fun with them. My name is Jules Simon. I'm a philosopher, and I practice philosophy and do research and writing at the University of Texas, El Paso.
And my name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy at EPCC.
And today we have the honor of having as our guest Dr. Charles Boehmer, who's a professor of political science at the University of Texas, El Paso, one of my colleagues. He earned his degree in political science from Pennsylvania State University and joined UTEP upon his graduation in 2002. He's been here ever since. He served as the chair of the Department of Political Science at UTEP from 2014 to 2021, and his main research focus has been international relations, with expertise areas in the effects of economics on interstate security and conflict, such as trade, investments, and economic growth, the effects of economics on terrorism, border studies, and the relationships of international organizations to peace. He's published in academic journals such as World Politics, International Organization, Journal of Borderland Studies, and the Journal of Peace Research. Dr. Boehmer teaches courses at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, such as Intro to Politics, International Security, International Organization and Law, U.S. Foreign Policy, Border Theory, Conflict Analysis, and various courses in research methods. He's also a 2013 recipient of the prestigious University of Texas Regents Outstanding Teaching Award. Welcome to our show, Dr. Boehmer.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So our first question is just really broad and just to kind of build a base upon which we can, proceed for the rest of the dialogue. And that first question is, what do you think of politics? What is politics?
Politics is open to many definitions, but one of the best succinct definitions that captured it is from one of the early political scientists, Harold Boswell, who defined it as who gets what, when, and how. And so I think that really explains whether we're talking domestic or international. It gives the sense that there are many different actors, roles, processes that could be positive or negative. It leaves it wide open for many different types of politics to be interpreted without being too specific.
Yeah, like if you're an autocrat, you get everything, right?
Yeah, well, many autocrats still have to please enough people. Yeah. And so, there's one novel theory that every leader has a winning coalition. It could be small or large, and you're going to have to reward a certain number of people no matter who you are. That's so that there's always somebody that's supporting the leader.
Why is studying politics useful?
It's hard to avoid because everything is political directly or indirectly, which makes it a very interdisciplinary field in that sense, because it really is one way of talking about how society organizes itself, how it interacts, how people behave in relation to institutions or the societal constructs. It's hard to carve political science off from other fields like philosophy, sociology, economics. It's inherently interdisciplinary because everything is political at some point. And I've even challenged students in Intro to Politics courses. It's like, try to name something that doesn't have some semblance of politics. The best thing I can think of is sleep, but if there's government-funded sleep studies, well then, even sleep would be political. And most every aspect of our lives are touched upon by policies that are related to law, and societal mores are also built on culture that is not detached from our institutions and our societal types of mores. So there's that synergy between society and institutions and people that we basically cannot avoid in that sense. So if we're ever going to try to make decisions or improve the condition, we're going to have to think about politics and how to do something, and maybe even try to think about what's worked in the past or not. But even that, politics also involves basically just trying to make sure that you're in a coalition that can lead, or what we think about as the whole substance of how societies are run. It's completely unavoidable that we would think about politics. To not think about politics would also lead to chaos.
Well, I want to follow up with that because maybe I'm wrong in this, but it seems to me that some of us care about, there's degrees, right? Of some of us care so much that some of us are running for office here or there or teaching it. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who really don't care. I was talking to a delegate and he was telling me that in the local last election, only 11% of people showed up to vote. So I agree with you that everything is political, and yet there's apathy. And so coming back to this, the question is, why is studying politics useful, or why is caring useful? I'm just wondering, what do you think we can do to help people become more involved?
Well, those that, of course, never think about politics are still affected by politics, right? I mean, the whole way that governments make decisions mean that in democracies, there may be some system by which they may influence policy, and some people try to advocate for policies that will help them or other people. But even if you're apathetic or you're ignorant about the fact that how politics works, you're still affected by it, right? And so that sense, having the idea that you may have some influence over the process, of course, allows for some possible ability to help yourself or help others. And so that's where the gradation of to the degree which people are aware about politics and understand it is fundamentally important in democracies, but also it affects, politics affects everybody in every society in ways that are unavoidable.
Right.
So having a knowledge about it and be caring about it makes a big difference if you have the ability to participate in it.
I agree with you in a lot of what you're saying, but if we think about our political situation and just simply the right to vote or having voting for our leaders, growing up and voting, I always found it really difficult that voting was just on one day in the middle of the week, and then there's always this phenomenon of people just not doing it, not caring, or feeling disenfranchised, and just holding out, not voting intentionally, right? But then there are other societies and governments, and you know probably better than me, that mandate that you have to vote. I mean, it's a requirement, being part of that society. I don't know, is Australia like that? I forget which country it is.
There's a few where you're expected to do it. It's something that's not my area of specialties that I remember, but the broader sense is, of course, in some places where it's mandatory, it's also not necessarily a case that your vote will matter or that you have a choice.
Oh, that's right. Like in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, or in current Russia, right?
Right.
You're mandated to vote, and if you don't, then somebody rats on you, you get sent away.
Right. And of course, this is politics just in general, because you could have the collapse of institutions in civil war, but that's still political, right? So that's where we talk about politics within structured countries that may or may not be democratic, but there's a whole range of acts that are political, including engaging in violence, whether it's being an insurgent, a terrorist, joining militaries and fighting conventional wars. And so all of these acts are broadly political. The ability to protest, the ability to go on a strike. So in the broader range of political acts, we have those that are legitimate within democracies or certain political systems, but people also engage in politics on a societal level, and sometimes that can be even violent and not necessarily, formally sanctioned or publicly condoned. And so that's one of the key issues, is that when we look around the world, there's a lot of insecurity, and so who has legitimacy to rule or government is very contested. And so we, to the degree we have hints of that in our society, it's very troubling. One of the key aspects that makes democracies viable is the loyal minority, the idea that you could lose elections and not be permanently then put in a secondary status, that you'll always be discriminated or have little chance of victory in the future for some policies or government action that would benefit you and your group. So that's the condition a lot of states are in, whether it's because the system's rigged, and sometimes that's based on ethnic, national, religious lines.
You mentioned everything is political. So I think I know your answer to the next question, but I'll still ask it. As you know, Aristotle described human beings as political animals. Do you think he was right on that one?
Absolutely, in the sense that we have individuals that may try to move off the grid in ways that are recluses and such, but the human condition, even before we have recorded history, you have the units of familial organization, smaller packs looking more like clans, right? So that's inherently social, and there have to be political decisions made in that just for the race to continue and thrive. to actually advance in civilization. I think Aristotle is perfectly correct and is one of the very first, not only philosophers in that way that we have such strong recorded wisdom passed on, but also and social sciencey. I mean, right? He's thinking theoretically. He's trying to have some idea of how his philosophy is grounded in what he thinks is nature, what human behavior is like in that sense, in order to actually argue, you know, here's what the best polis may look like. Here's how society may be structured in ways that aid to stability. And so he's also, I think, one of the, along with Plato, one of the clearest philosophical thinkers that continue the idea of basically, you know, how should society be governed in order for it to especially be stable. And so I think when you look at Aristotle, he understood clearly what may lead to stability or instability, and for stability you have to have the idea of human progress. And so I think that's a theme with a lot of the political philosophers that we read. It's that's something they value. Not all, but I think it's one of the key contributions that he makes earlier on.
When you said also somewhat political science of a scientist, I was thinking, yeah, that's right. You know, he sent his student out to conduct, let's see how this type of government works, you know, so.
And to be clear, philosophers were the ones that were studying politics long before there was anybody that would be called a political scientist. I mean, that's a more modern invention, more of the 20th century. But if you go back, right, they were like the legal scholars and there were the philosophers. And there were some economists that got into the idea of thinking about how society is ordered, such as Adam Smith, right? So when you think about a lot of these types of thinkers, what we would refer to as social scientists today, there are always these philosophers that had, I think, the roots in what they were studying. So that's why, you know, Adam Smith, he's talking about economics, but he's also talking about society and talking about the transformations of societies over time, in the sense of, you know, how they are progressing or how they may be more or less warlike based on how they're constructed and, you know, their main sources of income. You know, more primitive, nomadic, agricultural, agrarian, industrial, right? I mean, so the whole idea of studying society has those deep philosophical roots. So a lot of the humanities and social sciences, they have their roots in philosophy.
Yeah, and not only that, he had a clear conception of human nature. You know, what humans are like, right?
Aristotle.
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith.
Right. And of course, Aristotle. Yeah.
Categories.
What's that?
Different categories.
Different categories of humans, right. But I think with the modern period, and maybe you could tell us what you think about the difference between that kind of vision of human nature, that there are categorical differences in, say, Aristotle's.
And you know what, also I'd like
idea.
to just like step back and make a distinction, right? Because Aristotle and Plato were classic thinkers, meaning pre-Christian in the Western tradition. And then modern, by modern we mean not like current, but 1600s, 1500s through the 1800s maybe, which is not really modern, but we still call them modern.
But it's late modern. It is still modern.
Yeah, post-medieval.
Technically, Kant and Hegel
Just
count
to,
as
you know,
moderns.
just for our audience to think, okay, you know, classic, modern, not really modern.
And then medievals.
Mm-hmm.
The difference in the conception of human nature and who should be involved in the political system as, you know, architects or as, you know, counting members versus the classical epoch and the modern epoch. Because in the modern epoch, of course, we have enlightenment and the, you know, the
Science.
franchises opened up, right? So you have everybody's supposed to be involved and not just the aristocratic householders, which is basically what it was.
Yeah, but it's still everybody didn't really
Classical
mean
age.
everybody. It's but just more.
But in the modern period, I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah,
Is that
it
more
opened up a
people
little bit more.
opened up more.
Yeah, not enough, but
On the view, I mean, there's so many fascinating aspects. So on the one hand, there's the different conceptions of human nature, often referred to as man, of course, is that, you know, more positive, reformable, negative. I mean, if you're Thomas Hobbes and you're writing in the English Civil War, it looks like a darker view of humanity, that you need to have guardrails, right? You need to have the Leviathan government in order to make sure that there's order. And then you have the more positive views of humanity as well. And so, of course, that is often referred to as man, and it's also gendered because of we do see, for example, the fact that John Stuart Mill's writing about feminism in the 19th century is one that today a lot of it's like, duh, you know, we know this, we wouldn't necessarily think about it as radical compared to the time. And we think about the conception of women as being irrational, right? Like driven by things like, you know, the need to reproduce, that would be corrupting men kind of views, right? So it's when we think about human nature, we have to take not only the ideas that are more positive, violent. In international relations, especially conflict studies, where it did revisit this argument, you know, in decades past, whether people are hardwired for violence and such, in the, you know, and you kind of have like this Catholic bishop in New York City, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was talking about the fact that original sin was kind of just condemning humans to engage in violence forever. So you've had these different views, whether, you know, it's just like human nature to be darker, more violent, or more reformable, like you see in like Rousseau or Marx, where, you know, Marx is the ultimate optimist in the sense if you could have utopian societies without government, that means that humans can operate in ways that would be able to not necessarily require all the guardrails that most political philosophers would argue that humans need in order to have order and stability. So I think you've got those different positive and negative conceptions of humans in general, but then you do have those issues that increasingly that tackle the issue of gender or culture and the way that actually that affects our human societies and explains the differences. But then also you can have the opposite of, you know, cultural relativists that then almost dismiss the issue, right, and to argue that just different cultures have their own views of living and mores, right? So I think when we think about what human nature is, we start with those classic ideas that more positive, negative, violent, needs to be, you know, carefully guarded. Some people have limited capacity, others don't. But I think over time we've got much more nuance on trying to figure that out, and have to think about also the way that, you know, when we conceive in more postmodern views who we are, that we also are free ourselves to think more broadly and not necessarily within the constraints that we've been socialized in order to actually conceive different futures as well. So it's interesting the progression of even trying to examine, you know, what is human nature over time, and having, first of all, a very masculine version of that that didn't include women as being rational, to really then evaluate, okay, what are different conceptions or way that people can operate and function in society, and having more diverse views as well.
But even broadly speaking, so there's this the debate is out still about how our behavior is modified and in what ways we are or are not hardwired. You know, 70%, I've studied this a little bit, but about 70% of how we develop as individuals comes from our environment versus, you know, just 30% from our genetics. So you're basically born a certain way, certain skin color, certain structure, you know, physiologically. But then our environment shapes us, you know, completely. And there's broader ways to study this. Like, for instance, there's one way of thinking about conflict and peace studies, which is generally the area you work in, and that if in fact humanity is hardwired for conflict, what will happen is that there will always be perpetual war as opposed to perpetual peace, right? We're always going to go from one conflict to another, because that's the nature of being human, is to get into these demands for resources. And so, you know, if you're wed to that view, to that viewpoint, then you know, by necessity, it seems like you'd have to have a way of teaching and education that has to prepare the populace for ongoing engagement in conflict.
Yeah, and there is that debate within international relations. There are some that especially are heavily influenced by Immanuel Kant and really do see the possibility of a perpetual peace, although it may take much longer. But within international relations scholarship, there is also called the realists, for example, and they're divided. There are some that really do have the nature of original sin. Humans are hardwired for conflict. Wars will occur, and it's about delaying, managing, fighting them under the best conditions to avoid the worst case situation. There are others that argue completely different, that it has nothing to do with any kind of human nature, that it's the structure of the international system, that being an anarchic, there's going to have to be some type of selfishness, being concerned about, for example, your security, because no other country is necessarily going to look out for you. You have no absolute guarantee of that. And that's where Thomas Hobbes has often been used or abused in talking about the state of nature. And he flat out says in that brief sentence or two that the kings, the monarchs, they're still in that state of nature with each other, right? Because there is no hierarchical system that's providing rules and order and policing for the world's nations and such. So there's some that harp on that very strongly, but there's that sense of insecurity that is very real. So that means that there is that possibility for war. There are possibilities that there will be human rights abuses that other peoples around the world have a hard time combating because of the ability to actually feasibly get into countries and stop those abuses. So it'll be more abuses that go on than that would actually be stopped because of the lack of a hierarchical structure above states in order to regulate and manage the system. So in that way, some of these conceptions do have a dark sense of human nature that will lead to war, and others, they worry about that anarchy in the system, and it has nothing to do with human nature. But a lot of people do distinctly have that view, and I like to actually quiz students on this. Like, their gut reaction is actually really interesting to see. Are they generally trustful, optimistic, pessimistic? And that's of course going to be very much a function of their environment, what's happened in their lives, and some have thought about the world more generally. But that kind of helps predict whether or not they generally think people are good or bad, and that's at the end of the day kind of that gut response you could get from people without having exposure to more advanced theories in that sense, and it can help predict where they may actually think about society, the world in general, whether that maybe they can actually even be inspired to change the world for the better. If they start out with a gut negative experience about humanity, how much are they going to really think that we can reform our societies or the world in general?
This brings up an interesting point for me that has to do with social sciences, political science, and sociology perhaps, or anthropology, and an issue of methodology. So when a survey gets done, and I ask all these respondents for their gut reaction, right? There's the gut. How much can you trust the gut reaction? Because intuition is not something that we want to rely upon very strongly to build kind of scientific-based policy.
Yeah, and again, I say this as a
because it could be
class.
the case. It could be the case that what's your gut reaction about the future of the world, and I'm thinking of this book by Kahneman, right? The Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast book, right? And their research which they drew upon for experimental psychology and experimental psychology, right, was that you're going to get a positive response if they had donuts for breakfast, or if they're just having a good day, and so it's really hard to trust that kind of data if you're going to be building, a kind of general sense for what's going on, right?
I do agree with you, though, that our experiences do affect what we think of other people. Earlier, you mentioned anarchy. How do you define anarchy?
The lack of a hierarchical structure. So when we talk about
Is
political
that bad,
anarchy,
right?
the lack of government.
Because anarchy is often bad. Anarchy bad.
It has a stigmatized nature to the word in most circumstances.
And so it means a lack of a hierarchical structure.
Yeah. In that way, if we talk about it as being the lack of a hierarchical structure, like government, for example, right? For many, that is something they equate with chaos. And I point out, no, there's a difference between chaos and anarchy. And so in the international system, it's anarchic. There is no world government, but there's a lot of order, there's a lot of peace, and what stands out as newsworthy is typically the violence, the war, the human rights abuses. There's a lot less of that than good news, but that's what attracts the attention. So in that sense, it doesn't mean because there's anarchy in the world or even in society that there has to automatically be violence or turmoil and chaos. So when we think about anarchic cooperation where it's not government-led, right, that can be something that's very communal. It doesn't have to be mass society, it could be small pockets, right? So when you think about, are we a democracy in the United States, it's like not a direct democracy, right? But you can have communal organization and direct democracy without it being government-based or government-led in that sense. So of course that does happen on the small scale, and some have argued that could be writ large if society is better prepared for it and whatnot. So that is something where anarchy need not be directly associated with chaos or violence, but we do see the situations where governments collapse in the world. And oftentimes one of the key aspects is that nobody trusts anybody, that the government authorities tend to lose their reputation for any kind of fairness, respect, and whatnot. So we also see that there's a lot of negative trends in the countries that start to look anarchic, in the sense like Somalia has often been mentioned like that. So there's often a lot going wrong before it even starts to look like an anarchy. And the lack of fundamental trust in society, or that if you can't trust, the criminals from the police, that's a bad sign. And that's why we talk about sort of failed states in that way, because they're tending towards something that looks like anarchy. But there's already societal and political decay before it gets to that type of view. But if we talk about, anarchy in the more general sense, well, the world is anarchic. That means that there is war, right? Russia can attack Ukraine, and what does the world community do about it? There's no simple solution. There was no way to prevent that at the international level before it happened, but that also is not necessarily the way the world works. There is actually a lot of cooperation. There is much more peace than there is violence and war. And one of the calamities about the fact that is, if you really look at the period since World War II, many more people are more likely to die at the hands of their neighbors or their government than any kind of foreign peoples, foreign military, foreign terrorists. So the fact that the international system is anarchic has not led to lots of war between countries. The real political violence in the world is within societies. And so that's the main way that people will die. To fear foreign terrorist or foreign invasion is irrational for the vast majority of people on Earth, since most people are more likely to die in their own society by not necessarily their neighbors, but could be their neighbors. But it's like the same with murders. Most people are most likely to die by people they know and not serial killers in that sense. So there's that commonality where the anarchy of the international system does not necessarily make the world more warlike, but it opens up the possibility for wars like we see in Ukraine. But the good news is that there's a lot of order within the world without there being a world government.
This line of our dialogue is interesting because just today I was going over with my reading group. I have a reading group called Border Hegelians, where we study Hegel's writings and writings about Hegel. And we came to a passage in the book that we're working on about Proudhon, and he was the father of all anarchists, right? And he espoused a very similar position that you just sketched out, in terms of his anarchy, that in fact, what was the most important was a system of international relations that was non-hierarchical to the extent that you could emphasize better economic relations that would benefit individuals and individual entities, right? So that was the form of anarchy that he was espousing, right? So that the individuals would not be dictated to, in a kind of general similar way as Adam Smith's schema, that things get run by the invisible hand, right? Only he allowed for then revolutions to overturn those kinds of governments that were more hierarchically organized. And so I think the definition of anarchy you give, the lack of hierarchical structure, is a good one. And it has to do with the success, the relative success, of liberal politics and liberal global policies. And I'm not sure, I think that even a more radical form of anarchy should be called for that would even question that, because that still puts into place economic operators that are unethical and that hold things in kind of stable place. So you can get accustomed to the kind of stable regularity of inequity and injustice and just kind of get used to that stability.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that kind of trajectory for anarchy, which is this liberal mode, right? Liberal politics, liberal economics, seems to me at the roots problematic.
I want to make a distinction too between liberal and the way that we're using and liberal in the way that it's currently used. What is that distinction? Do you
Classical liberalism?
Right.
Yes.
What is classical liberalism, which is what we're talking about, as opposed to modern day liberals? Right? Because you're saying this is a good thing because of liberalism. Liberalism meaning questioning a monarch.
Well,
Is that what
in
you
that
meant?
sense, classical liberalism is this, as far as I understand, you can correct me, Chuck, please do, it's a way of practicing politics that is more, you allow the market forces to dictate what's going on, as opposed to, that's why we have the iconic term neoliberalism, right? So where you really kind of force that to an extreme. So this is the liberal politics.
Well, you're supposed
tied
to
with
stand off to an extreme, right? Not force it.
Actually, I think it's being deferential to the economic variables or the operators in our governing systems.
As opposed to a political liberal these days, right? So we might think of Biden, Obama, the Clintons, is what I wanted to differentiate between.
More progressive.
Yeah, I think that would be more a progressive position, right, as opposed to the liberal position. I don't know if you agree, but I think that liberalism took us up through the 19th century into the 20th, and then came up to some big problems in the 20th century with the two great wars.
I wanted, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so do you think that there is a place for anarchism within a democracy? Is democracy inclusive enough to include anarchists within it?
For individuals, sure. As far as, again, political activity or organization, there is the ability to, I think, do it more localized, right, on a communal level. And so for a state as a whole, I mean, it's contradiction in terms, if we have states and governments, then it's obviously not anarchical. But within a society, I mean, it's something where people can engage in that in a communal type of way, I think. I mean, maybe mean trying to find ways to separate from some of the connections that obviously would not be anarchical, but I think that's one of the ways people can engage.
Like you can run organizations
Yeah.
or systems that are anarchic.
And do it peacefully,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, because again, some have the notion of anarchy being associated with, nihilist
Violent.
assassinations in the end of the 19th century, and right, that's like that term that anarchists were very distinctly charged in the same way that terrorists are kind of thought of today, especially in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And some of that, was associated with, I think, the pains and the growing pains of society and liberalism during that period, right? The Industrial Revolution, it was part of the mass politics. So when I think about like classical liberalism, and also ideological forms of that, socialism, communism, Nazism, fascism, right? These are all mass mobilization ideologies that have their roots in the fundamental transformations of society and economics and politics. And so that's where I think political philosophy has that interesting roots, especially modern political philosophy, when those changes were going on, to start to see, how do you reconstitute, or what should be the plan for society, what's the best type of society, what's the best type of government. So those arguments you can see date back to the ancient Greeks, but they're revised and some of the ideas are recycled and recirculated to try to handle the changing society. And so now, we look at a more postmodern world where we have to think about what needs to change as society changes. But these, it's sort of the Owl of Minerva, right? I mean, are we talking about these issues right when we've already, that period's ended and we can start to see that? We're starting to crystallize what we went through in the last version. I mean, that's where I love, for example, Hegel's thought on, is Napoleon, really changing the things, or is he representative of the old order in that way? And so that's where, when we think about modern political philosophy, it's like how much of it's continuing in the 21st century versus, we now finally understood that period, and now is it now outdated and we have to think about the new processes? I mean, I think we really do that in a lot of ways, and even just thinking about what human nature is, I think is something that's really fundamentally important. But when we think about how society changed and how it's socially and economically constituted, that tends to, of course, make a big difference. And so when we go back to that anarchy question, on the one hand, instead of revolution, another way is that states and that type of the hierarchic or the inequities are sort of gutted internally by classical liberalism, right, like the European Union. But it also has had a backlash, right? So we see the rise of other forms of nationalism, populism, as kind of a backlash response to the classic or neoliberal kind of response, right? So like on the one hand, these forces, I think, can go different directions. It may make states less able to engage in war. It may, level them a little bit within circumstance, right? Germany still has a lot of influence in the European Union, but the countries within the European Union are more leveled than they were 200 years or 100, especially 150 years ago, 100 years ago in that way. So on the one hand, maybe it can have that effect, but it also produces maybe something that also can do the undoing, right? It sows the seeds of potential political change, or even something that is a stronger EU or weaker EU, disbandment of EU, disbandment of NATO. So in that way, it's just fascinating to see what the social economic forces can lead to.
It's an interesting experiment. Wait a second. That's a really interesting, because you brought up the EU, right? But it's a really interesting experiment, because the correlative one would be, is there a kind of Pan-American organization?
Right?
Or a Pan-African, right? Are those similar sorts of organizations that have the same kind of potential that the European Union has demonstrated for the ability to treat each other fairly and, keep their borders open, have a single currency? I mean, we still have pesos versus dollars, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even though we have some cooperative economic ventures like the former NAFTA, that's not led to more just relations between the three countries.
It was specifically designed not to. It's a preferential trade agreement, and it doesn't seek to be integrated any more than that, right? And so even within that, the fight over Mexican truckers, for example, you can see the politics that even undermine that logic. And that was a political fight between the U.S. and Mexico a few years ago in order to basically benefit U.S. truckers. It's like, Mexican trucks are unsafe, and that was actually a World Trade Organization NAFTA-type dispute for a bit there. But when we do look at the European Union, of course, some, is it cup half full, cup half empty, something in between? You get those different views. On the one hand, if you look at the fact that Western Europeans haven't massacred each other in the millions for 70 plus years, well, then maybe it's a good sign of success, right? But is it completely fulfilling the other societal needs across, the members and such? But it's seen as a level of success to be mimicked by many other international organizations in the world. So there's an IGO, an intergovernmental organization called the Caribbean Community, the African Union. You can go through different corners of the world. Especially in Africa and Europe, you find the most amount of international organizations where they're really trying to cooperate, collaborate. There's a decent amount in the Americas. The worst area as far as this is East Asia, South Asia, and it really kind of reflects some of the conflicts in those areas. But a lot of the regions of the world have a regional organization, or sometimes competing ones, that are modeled on the EU. So despite the debates about whether the EU is successful or not, it's distinctly seen as more successful than what's been going on in some regions. But the United States does not necessarily seek to participate on that level of integration for the various aspects that are distinctly American in that way. But if you go to South America or the Caribbean, you find that there are more efforts to do so. to integrate more.
I wanna
I
say
find it very successful,
maybe
but go ahead.
maybe more even earlier. I'm thinking of like Simón Bolívar before. Maybe I'm not sure with the European, in terms of the Western theorists, even though I've read them, I don't remember seeing like a pan-European, but like Simón Bolívar did it with, with the Americas. And then in Africa, Marcus Garvey, the Pan-Africanist. So there were previous to, I don't remember, I mean, if there were any European Western thinkers that were calling for a European Union before.
Well, famously Kant.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I was going to ask, because I know, Kant definitely, and he used the phrase League of Nations also more broadly. But, there was, I think you can find these thinkers in Europe that could distinctly see the ravages of war, the cost that was. And so I think that led to, many voices arguing for a pan-European type of organization. One of the key, not very well-known thinkers today, Karl Deutsch, who was another refugee from World War II, he had a conception of like a communitarian way of organizing at least the Western world, so that it would especially diminish the effects of nationalism, and especially nationalism was seen as one of the roots of World War I and World War II, and so that also kind of led to that European Union conception, with the idea of starting small and then building it in order to not be unrealistic and just, all of a sudden, boom, panacea type solution, going to get along. So the roots were in the European iron and coal and steel community, and then it built up over time. So it started with small possible ways to start to grow cooperation in the ashes of World War II. But the objective for many was to make the idea of another war in Europe unthinkable, which is interesting to see how shocking the Russian invasion of Ukraine is now, because it distinctly challenges that entire conception of politics in the region or the globe more generally in that sense. Not that it's not the only war like that. It's fascinating to see. And the Russian thinking about this is that, and a lot of the leaders, they tend to project their own society or what they value and expect to see that in their enemies as well. And so, from Putin's type of view, one of the key aspects is well, if the United States can go into Iraq and do what they do, why can't I do that in Ukraine, right? And so you have these completely contrasts with how states actually behave, especially the major military powers that may, undermine their own ideology, and they may look like hypocrites. And for those like Vladimir Putin, be able to draw the lessons is that, well, this is just a facade. But that's that idea of realism in international relations, that morals doesn't matter, not that you should engage in immoral behavior, but it's amoral, right? The ability to have a single ethical code for all humanity is not something that they believe in. So what does that mean for international law or any other mores? It's that you kind of get reduced to a cultural relativist type of view in that sense. So in the Western world, that completely clashes with the various ways that we tend to think about political philosophy, or at least the way we order the institutions, whether it's the European Union, the World Trade Organization, American democracy, parliamentary systems, right? It's all in that, still has the roots in the classical liberalism. And then you get somebody like Putin and goes, no, that's just all hypocrites. They're all decaying Western societies anyway, right? Which means that to the degree that that Western tradition in philosophy actually was used to set up these institutions, that it looks like it's now receding to the people like Vladimir Putin. And not just Putin, but many other people that even were maybe within the societies in the West.
I would like to ask you, you said earlier, different ideologies like Nazism, and you mentioned, I don't know, I'm thinking fascism, right? And then right now you also mentioned ideology. What is ideology?
I think a good way of thinking about ideology is that you take philosophic principles that you can sell, turn into praxis, try to take into action, that if there's too much meat on the bone or flesh, right, then it starts to look like philosophy, and it's not going to be consumed by most people that you want to mobilize politically. So it's, to me, like the watered down principles of philosophical views of society and economics that you're going to try to mobilize society by, right? So ultimately that has a vision, and I think there's often like a utopian vision behind every ideology that will never exactly be put together, right? But a right-leaning liberal, classically liberal utopia where like all problems with society would be solved, right, by the markets and healthy democratic communal participation, whereas a Marxist utopia would solve all the problems and reformed humanity, right? So that's what I think of when we think of ideologies, right? There are ways of mobilizing people along some philosophic ideas that are not too deep that you can try to actualize, but do have some kind of utopian conception behind them about what the perfect or ordered society would look like, where there'd be justice, right? Like trying to define justice over, the millennia in the sense that these tend to have some sense of what the justice would look like.
Do you think that all politicians are ideological? Do politicians have to be ideological?
I think most politicians have to be ideological in order just to be successful at politics. But my view of politicians is that first and foremost, a lot of them want to stay in power. I used to be more cynical. Well, I used to be less cynical, but kind of liked to have the hope that more politicians wanted to do good. But I think the key issue is that most leaders want to stay in power, whether in a democracy or not. And I think you can often look at to see the ridiculous lengths, the things that even American politicians will say in order to stay in power. But that there are some people that are pragmatic, but they have to have a brand in order to be successful in politics.
What does it mean to be pragmatic?
Pragmatic, for example, be not being highly ideological or partisan, but trying to be objective about what society needs without having that filtered through political lenses to the degree that we can do that as humans. It's hard to do that from our own personal experiences. But I think you find that there are some leaders that are a little less ideological, they're a bit more pragmatic, and most of them are not necessarily going to become like president or so because they probably need to be more ideological, but it may work in some places here or there depending on their constituents. But overall, I think that it's important for them to act ideological in order to many times get elected or get into office, stay there. And it's fascinating to see, for example, U.S. senators who are there for 30 years and how they change in the ways that they behave to stay in power, either for their own purposes or to keep their political party in power. So that's the issue. Are they really in it for themselves, or are they in it because they're part of a coalition and you have to play the role and toe the line, right? So Republicans have rhinos. The Republicans in name only, the ones that they suspect are not the true believer ideologues, right? And you have the fissures in the left between the ones that are more moderate and the ones that are more progressive, right? And so that's where ideology matters. Some people are more moderate, but they can't act like it because they have to toe the ideological line for the branding of their party to stay in power. So I don't think when we hear politicians truthfully say what they're saying, they're probably not telling the truth of what they really believe if they're thinking politically. But it's nice if they can, of course, help themselves and help people at the same time. But we do see corruption or other places where they're just duplicitous based on what they say and even undermine their own ideology in order to stay in power.
Yeah, there's a couple of really fascinating lines of dialogue we could get into, like the relationship between politics and truth, for one, right? That could take us up another whole hour or longer.
Just briefly, politicians cannot tell the truth because it's too complex. People don't have the attention span to hear the truth or the time. It's just politics, and that's the thing, all campaigns, they all have to be boiled down to simplicities, and that's why they know that if they push emotional buttons, that's what will tune people into politics. That's a human condition, but generally politicians know that emotional responses are better than cognitive ones.
And is that a comment, or is that an observation on your part based on your experience with how U.S. Americans get involved in politics or respond to politics? Because a lot of it is emotional button pushing.
And it's also fear. It's not just any emotion, but it seems to be pushing the fear button, get people scared.
Yeah.
I think it's
I'm
a
not
human
sure
condition.
Do you think it's holds in all other kinds of nation states, or is it something that's peculiar to the U.S.?
I don't think it's peculiar to the U.S. at all. And I think, think about Russians right now, right? Putin apparently has the support of the majority of the Russian people. So on the one hand, we know that I think there's a human condition, and this is where political psychology comes in, where people like to avoid cognitive dissonance. They engage in wishful thinking. They like to preserve their view of the world and not have it challenged because it can be destabilizing. That means, I think, either having a limited sense of information and media, with especially narratives that accentuate the positive, like in Russian culture, right? Defeating the Nazis and the huge role that the Russians played in that in World War II, to the degree that that's then used then to brand, Ukrainians as Nazis in the sense, right? To galvanize people, to tap into some of those traditional Russian views of being attacked so often, right? And to be able to manipulate that. And the sense is that a lot of politicians have to manipulate. You can do it for good, but you can do it for bad, right? How can you take the complexity of policy, economics, how society works, and explain that to most people? Because even people that have some attention span, they still don't have expertise in everywhere. So it ends up boiling it down to what people will respond to, what they'll pay attention to, which means that all politicians that are successful are manipulating. Some of us are willingly manipulated in ways that we want to be good, right? But it can be used for bad and distinct evilness as well. And so that we see that, right, the type of marketing campaigns. This is done in the United States in the media, right? We've got left and right media, and then it can become echo chambers where some people try to get out of that, but a lot of it is people hearing what they want to hear in that way. And so that's where ideologies and politicians, they hit the emotional buttons, and a lot of it's deeply cultural in some societies. So I think it's a human condition in that way.
I would like to ask you, what is political deliberation? What does it mean to deliberate about politics and law?
I think healthy deliberation would be thinking through all the best ways that you can make decisions and then potentially acting on them, implementing them. It depends on what level. So, legislatures are supposed to deliberate, but do they really do it in depth? Maybe sometimes on some issues or not. I think when people deliberate, especially if they're engaged in politics, that can be very healthy, right? To be conscious of your environment, to try to make sure you preserve what's good and improve what you can, right? And that, I think, is where political deliberation is directed towards that, right? Which means that people have to be politically engaged. They have to have some civic mindedness about where they live, the society, how people are affected, who's being affected in that way. So I think that could manifest very locally, or what it's supposed to also do is within legislatures. So if we have like direct democracy, then deliberation's got to be part of that, right? That could be much more local, communal. But at the highest level, then there should be ideally would be a bit better choice of word, deliberation about the options that wouldn't be so partisan, for example, that would benefit some people over others. So the deliberative process, you could think of at least the duty of legislatures or city councils or other places where there are actual people making decisions. And so it has a democratic or a representative connotation, democracy through representatives type of idea, that somebody's thinking through what's best for society, and then the choices are made by that and sets policy or law. I mean, that's the way I think of deliberation.
Did you deliberate long and hard on choosing political science as your pathway for a professional career?
Fundamentally, I was strange as a kid in the sense that I had a strong interest in geography and history. And my choice of international relations is that war as a sensational event got my attention before I was 10. And so as a freshman in college, I thought I'd be a history major. And I came to the conclusion, this is all in the past. And it's like, there's a field out there of political science, but especially international relations. And that was really capturing. To me, I really fundamentally want to know how everything works, how society works, how the world works. And so that to me is like, international relations is one of the most interdisciplinary types of studies, because you have to understand religion, culture, history, societies, economics, all the politics, why violence occurs. To me, that's completely fascinating and endless curiosity.
You had to be a bit of a philosopher.
Yes. Yes, and that's something I came to late because I had no philosophy courses as an undergrad. It was something that when I went on to graduate school, I should have had more courses in areas that were going to prepare me. So I had that at the graduate level and just self-taught reading. But I've loved it, and that's why I can see, because as I said in the beginning, the philosophers were the ones that were conceiving of all of society and everything within it. And so we have this compartmentalization into different disciplines that's unorganic and it's unnatural. And some people are too narrowly trained to think along one disciplinary line. And they say that, for example, I see some of the same quotes about democracy, linking it to like Winston Churchill is, kind of like the best system of all the flawed ones type of idea. It's like, you got to go deeper into the roots of classical liberalism, or even Aristotle, right? I mean, if you look at the origin of idea of natural law or something, it's like, no, there's some Aristotle that's recycled by Thomas Aquinas and other classical liberals. So the roots of who we are, they're deeply philosophical, and we're not just, reinventing things. Well, sometimes we are reinventing by, drawing from past philosophers, but the past philosophers, they were dealing with a lot of fundamental questions that have not changed in humanity. And that's what's fascinating. We still deal with some of the same problems that were thought about thousands of years ago.
That's why we're still in business.
Well, and you came, you got to the end of the list of our questions too. In what way is political science impacted by philosophy? And because, correctly, I think you identified philosophy as being at the root of a lot of the ways that we're able to raise questions about these interdisciplinary functions of our modern society.
But at the same time, it's a good thing that all these other disciplines have branched out, because you have different tools. I would like to say that, right? You have different tools of looking at the world and running experiments and looking at data that philosophers were not. We might be interested in, but we typically tend to stay more theoretical. So.
Yeah, I got to the data section of your article and I skipped right to the conclusions. Oh, to wrap things up,
Yes.
do you have like a kind of final question you'd like to ask us?
It'd be wonderful where you think philosophy's going. So I know, for example, the fascinating areas that tie in physiology to psychology, right? The way the brains actually operate, artificial intelligence. I mean, these are some of the themes I've seen roughly studied that affect philosophy. What do you think are the cutting edge, interesting questions that philosophy's got to get geared to answering in the near future that fundamentally would change some of the way we think about philosophy?
Personally, I think we're still dealing with the same questions. Yeah, and that's why I appreciate the sociology, political science, right, psychology, because you are coming up with new data that makes us think differently. Because I'm still trying to think about some of these questions here.
So I have a more specific response to that, and we can end our session today. Hannah Arendt is one of my favorite philosophers, and she said, all I want to do is understand what's going on. I want to understand the world. And I want to understand the world because that will help me to think more clearly, and that will help me to make better ethical choices, which then will lead to better politics. So thinking clearly, understanding, being able to think clearly, right, to act ethically, which then becomes the foundation for a better political order.
I love that. I think that really ties in well some of the other points made.
Yeah. I thank you, our audience, for joining us today, and I hope you look into some of our other episodes. And this is Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, and we'll see you next time.